creating a better day for the legends of the road with the non-slip van floors, protective interior liners, and full range of work van accessories. Trusted by major OEMs and fleets all across North America and Europe.
So, Fleet might be all about vehicles, but it's the people behind them who steer the real story. Welcome to Fleet Legends. The fleet industry's always changing, but one thing stays the same: nothing beats experience. In this series, sponsored by Legend Fleet, we're shining a light on the fleet professionals who steered through it all. These are the trailblazers, the problem solvers, the faces you've seen on the show floors and interviews who've helped shape the fleet landscape that we know today. I'm Lauren Fletcher, Bobbitt's VP of Content and your lucky host for today's interview. After years of reporting on fleet trends and technologies, I've learned that the most valuable insights always come from those who've lived it firsthand. So today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Theresa Belding, a true fleet legend whose story is packed with the kind of lessons you just won't find in a manual. So Theresa, let's roll it back to the beginning. Can you share a little bit about what brought you into the world of fleet and how that journey has led to where you are today?
Yes, absolutely. I think like most people, I stumbled into fleet. So way back in the day, in 1991, I started with a company called Pharmaceuticals, and I was doing data entry there, which was, as you can imagine, not a fun job. And about 2 years in there, I saw a posting on the bulletin board that there was an opening for a fleet and benefits coordinator. And I thought, what's that? Let's go find out about that. Chatted with HR again. It was a very informal process way back then. Chatted with HR, thought it sounded interesting. We had a tiny fleet of about 250 vehicles at the time. And from there, things just went like wildfire. Mergers, acquisitions, so many things, organic growth, and my position morphed from this, HR generalist, basically fleet coordinator. I handled workers' compensation for a little while. There were all of these little things that were combined until the point in time when, fleet became the focus because we had thousands of vehicles after starting with just a couple hundred.
That's a big growth too. And with more vehicles or more problems and paperwork and everything else that's required with that.
100%.
So, let's start by walking it back a little bit. So I like to think, every legend has an origin story. So in reflecting back on your career so far, what are some of the more significant changes that you've seen in the fleet management industry?
I mean, I think the big one that anybody would talk about is technology. Technology with the fleet management companies in how we do things, and also technology in the vehicles. I'm dating myself here, but my first vehicles came with manual roll down windows, manual locks. To today's vehicles that are very automated, so much technology that keeps our employees safer. So that just technology as a whole, I think, has shaped the industry and how we do things.
I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I was just telling her the other day about roll down windows and that motion of rolling it down when I think we were talking about being left in a parking lot when your parent went to the grocery store and how much easier it was because we could just roll the window down. And she was like, what? It was this whole fascinating thing. So it's, not that much of a difference in just a few years, but technology, I don't think they make cars with roll down windows anymore.
I don't think they do either.
So, in a long career, there's been a lot of challenges. Can you talk about a challenge that you recall that you really faced and overcame and either were very proud of the results or even had one of those aha moments from the situation?
I was reflecting on this kind of over the weekend and into this morning, and for me, it's our friends at the OEMs that have provided the most challenges in a couple of different ways. Just in the very recent future or the recent past, sorry, with the allocation model and having to expand your selector and make new contacts with new manufacturers because you needed 400 orders, for example, and you were only going to get 200 from your current OEMs, so you had to make new contacts. And then similar but different, maybe a decade before that, when we had the OEM strikes, and if you're locked down and committed to one OEM, you're not going to get vehicles, right? So, kind of my takeaway in all of that over the years is just remaining open to all of your options. Don't close doors. Keep those doors open. Keep those relationships open, because you don't know what's going to happen. Way back, we were primarily with Ford, and we had a significant concern with one of their vehicles and had to make an abrupt change. My company decided we were going to do that. We had to make an abrupt change to a different manufacturer, but because I kept those lines of communication open, that was a very easy transition to make.
There's a episode of the sitcom Friends that comes to mind right now. And I know there's a lot of fans out there, but I watched a lot of that late night television, and it's the one where they have the couch, they're trying to go up, and Ross is just constantly screaming, pivot, pivot. And that's all he's saying over and over again. And I think that is probably what's being screamed in most fleet managers' heads on a daily basis while they're going through this, is just pivot loudly and clearly.
Oh, 100%. And in all things, in even the types of vehicles that you offer in your selector, fuel in most of the country used to be around $1.50, right? So when that was the case, fuel economy wasn't as big of a factor in your decision making. But then as fuel prices started to go up, we had to pivot and say, we can't run these big vehicles anymore. We need to switch to something different, even though we were trying to keep our drivers happy and pleased with what we were offering. We had to pivot and do something different.
And that can even be regional. I mean, looking at, gas prices in the top 10 and bottom 10, gas or diesel, it's a huge difference between the lowest price in the States and the, highest price. Can be dollars in difference, which has a big impact when you've got a ton of vehicles that you're operating, across large regions. Yeah. So, experience absolutely doesn't come easy. It's time, it's work, it's sweat and tears. Let's get into the takeaways that have really stuck with you. What are some of the more important lessons you've learned in fleet management that you really think are crucial for new fleet managers to understand today?
I think the biggest lesson, and sometimes I feel like a broken record when I say this, is to get involved with AFLA, with NAFA, with, your fleet management companies will have forums sometimes, and find your peers. NAFA used to have a pharmaceutical group at the expo, and we did a survey every year, and then we reported back at the IME. And that's kind of where I got my first taste of that knowledge sharing, because no one inside of my company was an expert at fleet. Even when I started, I was doing 3 jobs and fleet was one of them. And the leadership of my company was learning along with me. So to be exposed to that group of experts and to be able to tap into them and rely on them and commiserate with them on all of the things that we're dealing with. And I wish when I went into that very first pharmaceutical workshop, I was terrified. I didn't know any of these people. I hardly knew what I was doing. So I was a little tentative at first. So just really jumping in with both feet, meeting as many people as you can, benchmarking with as many people as you can, and keeping those lines of communication open is the biggest benefit, because that's where you're going to learn. You're going to learn from other people who've done this, not some seemingly expert inside your own company.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think we all wish we had the opportunity to go back in time for whatever reason or another. In this one, we're going to go back in time in our career. If you could, what was one thing you wish you had known when you first started out?
Oh man, I wish I had known about the industry organizations, NAFA, AFLA. Thankfully, through fleet management vendors that would come to see me, OEM vendors that came to see me, they started to introduce me to those organizations. We had a pretty strong local chapter in St. Louis for NAFA, and getting to, my first INE, and then, years later getting to my first AFLA, and just getting integrated into this pool of experts. I wish I had that even 5 years before I did.
I mean, it's an incredibly helpful industry. It's something I jumped in as a journalist, not even a fleet manager, and have been so incredibly welcomed and educated on everything. And I think one of the favorite parts that I had of the interview I just did with Lisa Neggs was she was talking about when she first started out and her struggles and how she was able to call up Sue Miller at a completely different company who she did not know and ask about a policy. And Sue's I'm happy to help. And I think it's been a part of this industry that, they are so incredibly helpful and welcoming. And if you've got a question, well, they don't know how to answer it. They probably know somebody who does. And I, love that. Just jump feet first, dive in, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
There are, I've managed other things. I've managed a travel and expense program. I've managed, HR benefit programs, and I have never found an industry or a network of people like I have in the fleet industry.
Same. So, one of the things we're really trying to do is help new fleet managers answer questions or learn from mistakes that others have made. From your perspective, are there any rookie mistakes that you're seeing new fleet managers make, or just new people in the industry that you'd recommend they steer clear of?
So I think the biggest mistake is thinking that your fleet management company, for example, is your one-stop shop, right? So keeping an open mind to meeting with vendors who are not your fleet management company, competitors of your fleet management company, companies like remarketing companies or safety companies that break off a little piece. I'm not saying you have to do that, but be open to listening to what these people have to say. Right? Because again, back to the couch analogy, sometimes you have to pivot. If something isn't working, you might have to pivot. And if you haven't nurtured those relationships, you don't know where to go. You don't have a place to go if you haven't kept in contact with all of the OEMs and the remarketers and all of the fleet management companies and all of the other, ancillary vendors that can help you, and those people are good resources too. I've gotten a lot of education from people I've never even done business with.
I love it. So, Fleet is a balance of people, processes, technology. I mean, probably 20 other things on top of all that. And through your career, you've definitely had a chance to see it evolve. Thinking about what's worked well, what practices or innovations have you found to be the most effective in managing a successful fleet?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many fleet best practices that, I feel like I could just, hit the low hanging fruit, right? Factory order where you can versus stock orders. But I think the biggest thing that I learned, a couple of things, two parts to it. One is, you know, managing to a TCO, right? So when you're putting together a selector, make sure you're looking at the TCO versus just the cap cost, right? But then the second piece of that is making sure that as you go along, you're educating the people in your company who need to support your decisions, sign off on your decisions, so they understand.
Yeah.
Right? We might have something with a high TCO, but it's got great resale. So we're gonna offer this because we're gonna recover some money on the back end, right? Or we're gonna spend a little bit more for an EV because we're not gonna spend as much on fuel. But if you're just looking at the cost of the vehicle, like many procurement models might suggest, you're missing the whole picture. So
No.
that's my
I know, I love
that's my
it.
big one.
I mean, and so as we were talking about earlier, I mean, if your fuel costs can vary, there are so many parts to it. It's not just the cost of the vehicle, there's maintenance costs, and that changes dependent on the vehicle and how you're operating the vehicles. And I think when you're in a lot of businesses and places where their main concept of fleet is like Navy boats out somewhere, that's what they've heard that term referenced with. There is a lot of educating involved. And I think, you got to make sure you're not assuming that just because they understand how to purchase a vehicle personally at a dealership, that they know it's very different when you're a fleet purchasing lots of vehicles, looking at several different factors and relationships and everything else involved. So we touched a little bit on technology and that it's really come a long way. How do you think it's changed fleet management? And what advancements do you think have really been the most game changing for you?
I think so. Again, dating myself very, very much here. When I was placing orders with the fleet management company for the very first time, I was typing them on a typewriter, quadruple carbon copies, and you're mailing a copy and mailing a copy, keeping a copy, all of those things, to where now, if you are a sales fleet like I have managed, drivers are ordering on their own online. So I think that the biggest the takeaway there is just the speed at which you can deliver information and the speed at which you can receive information, and the abundance of information that you have access to pretty much at your fingertips that just wasn't there. So many technological advances with the fleet management company systems. The very first systems, for lack of a better word, you had to download software on your computer and you had to, log on to the internet and all of those things. And today, you don't even think about going into your vendor websites and looking up something in 30 seconds that may have taken you an hour. 15 years ago.
I know one of the articles I recall writing when I first started writing about 20 years ago about fleet myself was about, just fuel logs and logging their mileage and the challenges when they had to, really count on drivers to make sure when they were fueling up, they were correctly tracking miles and then having to wait till all that data came back to be able to figure out if there was any issues or what that meant and the manual entry and calculations that were required and trusting that your drivers put the right stuff in there in the first place that you were getting the data on. And now it's trackers, it's systems, it's a quick dashboard report that you can pull up with accurate info that you can trust and will probably even send you an alert and tell you what to do with that information. So it's a long way in just a very short period of time. So running a fleet is one thing. Again, it's vehicles, it's TCO, it's life cycle costs, but leading a team of people is a little bit different. Especially through ups and downs, mergers, acquisitions, everything that I think that, you've dealt with over your career. What strategies have you really used to build, lead, work with a successful team?
The biggest contributor for me in leading a successful team is making sure that they understand why we're doing what we're doing, right? It brings them into the decision making. It helps them understand the goal of what we're trying to get to. And it takes away that, well, we're going to do it this way because we've always done it this way, right? So if you're telling people this is the goal I'm trying to get to, we have to increase the fleet or decrease the fleet, and here's why, here's our goal. It also lends itself to the opportunity for them to give you another way to do something, right? Because I've been doing this for a long time. So I am very comfortable doing what I've always done and what's always worked. But if there's a better way, if an employee understands the end goal and why you're doing it and how you're trying to get there, they can provide a new process, a new way of thinking of things that I sometimes lose sight of because I've been doing this for so long.
Yeah, I think it's there's a picture of a shape of multiple square and a triangle and other things, and there's not always one right answer to a problem is what this puzzle's kind of trying to demonstrate. That just because it looks like it doesn't go in this way, you look at it from a different angle and there could be the missing piece or the shape that you were looking for. And I love that. So, let's look ahead for a minute then. So I know, the next generation's watching right now. They're looking to see what careers they want. Aaron Gilchrist and I have a goal together that we're going to have somebody tell us that they wanted to be a fleet manager when they grow up. It hasn't happened yet, but it's a goal that we've set. And fleet's always evolving. And so what advice would you give to new entrants, new people looking at this as a career or just, stepping their feet in as a new career today?
Educate, educate, educate. Just grab all of the information that you can, right? NAFA has some great formal education. AFLA is developing new formal education, attending conferences and even your fleet management company forums. There's so much information available but you have to go get it and you have to be open to it and you have to want to learn about this. It's a constant learning process, even at this late stage of my career, I'm learning new things. We've got new technology. We have electric vehicles, which I know have been around for a while, but that's a whole different type of fleet management. When I was in Austin a month ago, we got into a self-driving Uber. These are the things that are coming in the future, and you have to stay on top of learning about all of these technologies in order to stay relevant and stay at the top of your game in this industry.
So you led really well into the last question that I wanted to ask you today, which is with, a look ahead further down the road, what trends or challenges are you foreseeing for the future of fleet management, and how can new fleet manager, even veterans today, prepare better for them?
Be open. And, I talked about this a little bit earlier. Meet with the vendors who are calling on you. Even if you're not due for an RFP, if you're not interested in going out to bid, meet with all the people, because they all have something to bring to the table. They all have new information to give you, most of the time for free, but you just have to be open to it.
Theresa, thank you so much for sharing your journey and all of your valuable insights that you've gained along the way. It's stories like yours that remind us that fleet isn't just about vehicles and tech. It's about the people driving the change. So before we wrap up, I'd love to give you the last word. Is there anything you'd like to say to the folks watching or to your fellow fleet pros that are tuning in?
Oh my gosh. First of all, fleet is fun. And kind of going back a little bit to the question about leading a team, there are a lot of fun things to do in fleet. The OEM meetings, your fleet management company forums, you have to let your team have some of the fun too. Because it's not fun if all you're doing is the work.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? And your team needs to be making their own connections so that they're becoming independent and they're increasing their knowledge. Network times 100 is my biggest piece of advice ever.
I love it. Well, we'll make sure we drop some links to some of the upcoming conferences and events. There's several still coming up this year alone, so we'll drop some of those in the description. For everyone else, we hope you're walking away with some solid takeaways and maybe a little bit of inspiration too. If you've got thoughts on this episode, drop them in the comments. If you know someone with a legendary story, make sure you tell us who you want to see next. We've got more great conversations on the way, so stay curious, stay connected, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Fleet Legends.